Yes, good afternoon. This is Eric Orff with New Hampshire Fishing and Wildlife YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe on my YouTube channel. Well, this afternoon I'm going to talk about an animal that is very interesting historically here in New Hampshire. And of course I'm going to delve back into Helen Silver's History of New Hampshire Game and Fur Bearers. This afternoon I'm going to talk about wolves. I was the fur bearer biologist for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department from around 1980 until I retired in June of 2007, and saw some interesting changes. Our coyotes numbers grew during that time, eastern coyote, and I would occasionally get a wolf sighting. So none of those were ever proven, and as far as I know, in New Hampshire there are no wolves. But of course, our eastern coyote has a lot of wolf DNA. I sent two different groups of coyotes in for DNA testing over the years, and certainly some came back. And reading some literature, there can be anywhere from 8 to 25% wolf DNA in coyotes that were tested in Maine. But wolves, of course, are much larger than that. Wolves than our coyotes. Our coyotes averaged around 35 to maybe a big one 50 pounds. In Pennsylvania, I read recently they averaged between 45 and 55 pounds. So wolves were generally more than double that, more closer to 100 pounds. Although in central Canada and Ontario, there is a wolf there that averages 77 pounds, so not much larger than our eastern coyote. So that's kind of an interesting fact that although the historical timber wolf was more like 100 or 125 pounds, there are other subspecies that are smaller. But getting back into the history here in New Hampshire, according to Helenette's book, wolves were really not all that common, although the early settlers, beginning in 1662, Salem, New Hampshire, adopted a 10-shilling bounty on wolves, and there were state bounties that followed soon after. I know, looking at this historical perspective of bounties in New Hampshire, we have 1679, the General Assembly issued a bounty for 40 shillings for a white person killing a wolf, and 10 shillings if a Native American killed a wolf. Wolf bounties varied, generally staying quite high, 10 shillings or more, and then by the 1800s, 1801, of course when we had our own legislators, the bounty was $20 for an adult wolf and $10 for a young of the year, and bounties continued. Looking at the historical perspectives, according to this, the bounty records were not very good for many of those years. As we know, looking at other animals I've looked at, bears and whatnot. 1882, a bounty of, there were 2 wolves bountied. In 1885, 1. The next time wolves were bountied, 3 were bountied in 1888. The last records here, the last few records, 1893, 12 wolves were bountied, 1894, none, 1895, 2, and that is the last record of a wolf being bountied in New Hampshire. So basically, looking at a historical perspective, wolves kind of swept into the state, so they weren't all that common all the time, even though the settlers were paid bounties, first by individual towns and then by the state. But if we look at what was New Hampshire like back in the 1800s, well, I have read a book, Reading the Forested Landscape, that basically almost all the stone walls we see across New Hampshire were built by the 1820s to contain sheep. So New Hampshire had like 1 million sheep by the early 1800s. So if we had that many sheep, wolves were probably already pretty much depleted by the early 1800s, because wolves do kill sheep, And if you, in reading that book in the 1700s, yes, well, the wolves came in and it killed as many as 50 sheep in one night. So I'm thinking by the early 1800s, the wolves had really been decimated in the state. And there were some records here in her book again that wolves seem to come in waves. 1744, 1764, and 1784 were particularly bad winters for wolves. So they were not all that common, but they tended to come in waves about every 2 decades. Also, there's a record of on the New Hampshire trappers reported in 1930 that he took a wolf in New Hampshire. And interesting enough, if you look at our neighboring state, Maine, in the 1990s, there were 2 wolves killed in Maine. One in 1993, that was a female wolf, and one in 1996. So wolves have been in northern Canada historically. For many years I was the fur bearer biologist here in New Hampshire, and we would have an annual meeting of the eastern fur bearer biologists from Virginia to the eastern Canadian provinces. And I know from talking to the fur bearer biologists from Quebec that several thousand, I think up to 4,000 wolves were trapped each year north of the St. Lawrence River, because the Canadian government did not want wolves south of the St. Lawrence River, and they did all they could to limit that expansion of wolves into southern Quebec south of the St. Lawrence River. So they did all they could to prevent that, because that is where their agriculture is, that's where their livestock is, and also where they have white-tailed deer. And so they intentionally killed off wolves, that any of them that came south of the St. Lawrence River, to prevent their spread basically into the United States. And there are records here that I noticed that not long ago there was a wolf killed south of Quebec City about 2 decades ago. So coyotes, I mean wolves could get here probably if they weren't so intensively controlled in Canada, but they also are western wolves, as we know, in Minnesota and Michigan and out that way, and they tend to be spreading eastward. So there is a potential, a more likely potential, for some of those western wolves to spread this way. We know that, we've had coyotes disperse over 200 miles. So some of these animals can travel long distances. So what is the probability? For decades now, I've basically said that we've set the table and created the habitat here in New Hampshire for wolves. We now have over 120,000 deer, whereas in the 1880s there were almost no deer according to the records here. So the habitat was eliminated, forests were cut off. New Hampshire was largely, say, sheep pastures by the early 1800s. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the farmers that went off to the Civil War decided, hey, there's better conditions to raise crops in other states, and they came back and packed their families up and left. So our forests, beginning in the early 1900s, began to come back, and now we're, what, 83 or 84% forested? So we got lots of habitat for wolves, we got a lot of food for wolves. They just haven't arrived, and I expect it in my lifetime, and that might occur. So wolves certainly are at our door in one respect or another. We've got the habitat for them, and when you learn that a female wolf was killed in Maine in 1993 by a bear hunter, we realize that it is probably somewhat likely that over the next coming decades that wolves will reestablish themselves in New Hampshire. But even though people do report wolves, we have hundreds, probably, if not thousands, of game cameras or trail cameras out across New Hampshire. And if there were some wolves, especially a resident population of wolves, my suggestion is that they would be captured on some of these cameras. So I don't believe we have a resident population of wolves yet. Is it possible? Absolutely. So will wolves return to New Hampshire? They may very well, and I'll be listening for them.